you ever been on a car journey with little children? And the question? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? A constant refrain. How do you explain distance to a little one? How do you explain time? Yeah, we're nearly there, nearly there, nearly there, nearly there. I remember car journeys with my niece and nephew when they were small, and that was often what they were saying. Are we there yet? And in an effort to distract them from that kind of constant questioning, we would play kind of games, you know, alphabet games and number games. You've probably done it all too. And sometimes we would do a kind of an I Spy, and sometimes it would be kind of, who can see us, you know, whatever it might be first. And on one occasion we were travelling along, and I think it was my mum said, look, over there, the yellow field. And my niece said, I want to see a blue one. I want to share with you some thoughts that focus around a parable that Jesus told. And it begins with a question that is around that kind of are we there yet type of theme. How much further? But I'm going to come back to that. Just leave that tantalizing there. The story focuses around a man who had lent some money to somebody else. And it was time to call in the debt. And so, not unreasonably, he went out and he found the man who owed him the money, and he said, it's time to pay. And the man who owed the debt said, I haven't got it, actually. And he said, but it's time to pay. If you give me more time, can you be a bit more patient, and I'll get the money together and you can have it all. He begged for more time. But the man who was owed the money, the lender, said, I'm really sorry, you've had your time. And he had the man put into prison because he couldn't pay the debt. Probably not an unusual occurrence. Nothing wrong with that. The lender was owed the money. The man, the borrower, couldn't pay. So there was payment of another sort. He was punished. The man was within his rights to collect the debt. And you don't have to read very much Charles Dickens to know that the debtor's prison was quite a common feature in many of his books. A common way of life. You borrowed money, you couldn't pay it back, you went to prison. That rather got in the way of you earning money, and so the cycle went on. You had to rely on family to bail you out. So what's wrong with the story? Well, you probably realise that actually that's only half the story. I've started halfway through, because there's a bit more that was actually in the beginning that I've missed out on. If this was the story, the parable, as Jesus had told it, we would have had probably quite a lot of sympathy. Actually, probably for both men. The man who didn't get his money back, who had been generous in lending it, and the man who borrowed the money and couldn't pay it back. And yet, that wasn't quite as Jesus told. So we're going to read from Matthew chapter 18, and this time we'll start at the beginning of the story. Starting at verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. It's quite a different story when you tell it from the beginning, isn't it? Our attitude towards the man changes, because we see the man who, as it turned out, was both borrower and lender, attempting to collect his debt. He himself was a debtor, and he owed an unimaginable amount of money to the king. Unimaginable. And the king attempts to reclaim the debt, and the servant can't. It's a repeat, isn't it? One story repeats the other. And the king suggests ways that the money could be found, and the servant begs for time, for patience. We've heard it all before. Only this time it's different, because the king was moved with compassion. Literally, if we look back at the origin of that word, moved in his guts. And he cancelled the debt. And he was free to go. He cancelled the unimaginable amount of money that he was owed. That is an outrageous thing to do. Absolutely outrageous. The man has been released from a debt of mammoth proportion with no conditions attached. For this man, the world has shifted on its axis. There's no other way of saying it, really. The world has shifted. And not unreasonably, we expect him to have changed because of that, don't we? That's not unreasonable, is it? If I'm driving along the road and somebody lets me out, I let somebody else out. Isn't that the way the world works? Or I let somebody else out and then I expect him to do the same. And I get quite cross when he doesn't. I watched, I don't know whether you did, the Pride of Britain Awards. Anybody see the Pride of Britain Awards? On a couple of nights ago? People, children, whose worlds had shifted on its axis. Lives changed by things that happened, circumstances, who then went on to make changes themselves because of what had happened to it. They refused to let their circumstances beat them into the ground. They used, bless you, they used their tragedy as a springboard for good. This man's life has changed beyond all recognition. And he was completely unmoved by it. completely unmoved. That's why the story is so shocking. And we feel a sense of injustice and kind of outrage. So when the story is told, usually there's that kind of at the point where he throws the man who owed him just a tiny, tiny bit of money into jail. So the question is, why do we, forgiven as we are of so much by God, forgiven of a debt that we are completely unable to pay, why do we live in such a way that so often just denies it? That doesn't show that our worlds have shifted. I think part of the problem is that we don't actually have a clue exactly of how much we have been forgiven. We're quite nice people, aren't we? Quite good. Not broken any of the major rules of life. Haven't done anything majorly wrong. Never been to prison. Never broken a proper law. Well, I might. I try not to. The trouble is, we have massive blind spots, don't we? Massive blind spots. And we think that we are wearing our nice white shirts, but we're blind to our hidden motives, blind to our hidden agendas, blind to the things that put I first in so many things, nicely covered up, of course, so that it looks like we're doing something for somebody else. We are so unaware of how much we offend others, let alone how much we offend God. Unaware that the nice white shirt that we think we are wearing is like ashes in the presence of God, that holy presence of God. And the truth is, the work of the cross is done. It's done. God didn't wait for us to turn to him before he did it. God's forgiveness is there. As that song says, we come as we are. We don't have to change before we come to God. We come as we are. The forgiveness is there for us, whether we choose to live in it or not. His forgiveness is not conditional on us forgiving others first, but he does expect us to live out that forgiveness. And if we know for ourselves that outrageous act of forgiveness that God has done for us, then it does transform our world. Transforms our place in it, transforms our behavior, our actions, our hearts, our lives. And if it doesn't, we haven't understood it. We haven't begun to understand it. Such that the man, Gordon Wilson, you may remember that name, he was able, on that day of the Enniskillen bomb, to stand in the debris and say, I forgive those people who have murdered my daughter. What an outrageous thing to say. He had, of course, to walk out that forgiveness day by day by day by day by day by day by day. And Peter said, how many times do I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times. He thought he was being clever, you see. Not a random number, because the rabbis taught that no more than 3 times was necessary. No more than 3. So Peter, I guess, thought, well, if I double it and add one for luck, that's surely got to be enough. 7, the number of perfection. And Jesus says, no. Because that number of perfection is a bit like saying, always. doesn't quite put it in this gospel, but in the other gospel it says 70 times 7, doesn't it? That's like saying 70 times always. How many is that then? 70 times always. Are we there yet? No. The truth is we've got a long way to go. We begin at the cross. We begin knowing our own forgiveness. Accepting the guilt, the debt is gone. And we are free. Amazing grace.